continue this Father's Day theme just for a little bit longer. I was sent this morning some, what I thought were very wonderful Father's Day comments. And I thought I would just share them with you just for a moment. Some of them are humorous, some of them are serious. The first one is by Bill Cosby. It says, "Fatherhood is pretending the present you love most is the soap on a rope." This one's a little more serious. "One father is more than 100 schoolmasters." I like this one. There should be have you ever sung the song, "If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands"? There should be a children's song, "If you're happy and you know it, keep it to yourself and let your dad sleep." This one's kind of, I think we've all lived this one. "By the time a man realizes that maybe his father was right, he usually has a son who thinks he's wrong." "It's admirable for a man to take his son fishing, but there is a special place in heaven for the father who takes his daughter shopping." "A father carries pictures where he used to carry his money." There are 3 stages in a man's life. He believes in Santa Claus, he doesn't believe Santa Claus, he is Santa Claus. "Being a great father is like shaving." This one's a little more thoughtful. "Being a great father is like shaving. No matter how good you shaved today, you still have to do it again tomorrow." "Dads don't have to be tall and broad-shouldered and clever. Love makes them that way." And then the last one, and it really is a lead-in to my message to share with you this morning. "His heritage to his children wasn't words or possessions, but an unspoken treasure, the treasure of his example as a man and a father." If you had a dad that was like that, say amen. Amen. I'd like you to open your Bibles with me this morning to the Old Testament, because we are going to consider from 1 Kings chapter 22. We are going to take a look at the life of a king who was significant to the people of Israel. This is one of my favorite areas to read from in Scripture. The historical accounts of the people of Israel, because Israel's history traced God's faithfulness to keep his covenant to them. And we can see how God worked uniquely in their lives. But it's also a history of Israel being faithful to their part of the covenant, and how they either did or did not live out what they had said that they would do with God. Of course, along the way, we find wonderful stories of God's miraculous intervention in their lives. We see how he intervened when nations would rise up against them and want to defeat Israel and to take them into a captivity of sorts. And so we find these great stories of how God worked on their lives. All of the kings of Israel are listed in these books in their chronological order. Those that are well known and those that aren't as well known, and those that we would describe as scoundrels. Matter of fact, there was one I was reading this morning, and it said, "Such and such king passed away to the sorrow of no one." Think about that. This king passed away to the sorrow of no one. That's pretty heavy, isn't it? But there's a phrase, and it's really the phrase that I'm legging off of this morning as I share with you. And the phrase is this: and he followed in the ways of his father. And you find that repeated often. And you probably about 8 or 10 times through the historical books. And he followed in the ways of his father. Very powerful words for us to look at. Some of them are noble as they relate to a guy by the name of Hezekiah. Some of them are tragic as we read about a king by the name of Uzziah, who began with a very powerful encounter with God, only to find that powerful encounter to become something that built arrogance in him. And the last few years of his life, he became beset with an illness that made it impossible for him to get out of bed. And he had to actually transfer his leadership as king to his son. All because he became arrogant before God, and God held him accountable for that. By the measure, but the measure of a king seemed to be how he compared with his father's example. And since this is Father's Day, it's appropriate for us to consider not only a father's influence on his family, but in a larger sense, I want you to consider with me this morning the issue of the power of influence. The power of influence. Now, we all know that there are some people who are very powerful and very influential. Probably, if I were to ask you to name the most powerful person in the United States, who would it be? The president. Okay? And probably, to a certain degree, the most influential person in the United States, at least with the majority of the populace. But there are a lot of other people who are very powerful and who are very influential. And they make a difference in the world around us. They have impact. Some of them have very wide-reaching impact. Some of them are also involved in government, and they affect legislation, and they affect how the economy moves. Probably at one point, the second most powerful person in the United States would have been the guy that stepped down from being the Fed chairman. His name escapes me now. He's an older guy with a white beard, if that helps. But everybody listened to what he had to say, because what he had to say affected how money was going to be handled, and how interest rates were going to go, and how easy it was going to be for people to buy or not buy homes. And it became he became a very influential person in a position that maybe wouldn't have had that much influence. So the issue that I want you to see is, you may not have influence like that, but you have influence. If you're a parent, you have influence. You have an opportunity with your children to touch their lives and to set them on a course that will direct their lives. I don't mean make all the choices for them. They will come to a time in their lives where they will make the choices for themselves. But as they are children growing up in your home, you have an opportunity to influence them. Now, at the same time, there are going to be other people who will be influencing them. People in the school, people that they go to school with, people that they hang out with. They have influence on them as well. And so as a parent or a grandparent, it becomes exceedingly important for you to recognize the opportunity of influence that you have on your children. A significant influence. I met a gentleman this week, and just been diagnosed with a terminal illness. And since his diagnosis, he said he has had a steady stream of people coming by to visit him. Not only family members, but people that he's worked with, people that he's interacted with in churches that he's served. He said it's just been a steady flow. He said, I've gotten Facebook messages, one upon the other, upon the other, upon the other. Why? Because he has had influence in those people's lives, and he has touched them, and now they are coming to minister to him when he needs their help. The power of influence to touch others is a great thing. And the king that I want you to see with me about this morning is a king by the name of Jehoshaphat. Aren't you glad your parents didn't name you that? And we find his story actually twice in the historical accounts. We find it where we're going to read this morning, but then you also find it in 2 Chronicles as the history is retold there. But we're going to begin at verse 41 of 1 Kings chapter 22. Jehoshaphat, son of Asa, became king of Judah in the 4th year of Ahab, king of Israel. Jehoshaphat was 35 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 25 years. His mother's name was Azubah, daughter of Shilhi. In everything, listen to this, in everything, he followed the ways of his father Asa, and did not stray from them. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. The high places, however, were not removed, and the people continued to offer sacrifices and burn incense there. Jehoshaphat was also at peace with the king of Israel. The high places that he mentions there are altars that were built. The people of Israel and the people of that time would go out to all the high places. They would select hills around the area because they felt like those were closer to heaven. And they would put their altars there, and then they would offer sacrifices. And the gods that they would offer sacrifices to were gods other than, in most cases, gods other than the people of Israel, or the God of Israel, Jehovah. And so it became an act of idol worship on their part. That's why he was talking about taking those down, because it still showed that in the hearts of the people of Israel, that they worshiped God and they went to Jerusalem to worship in the temple, but then they still had all this other stuff going on the side. And their hearts were not fully surrendered to God. But the thing that this tells us about Jehoshaphat is that his heart was. That he was the son of a man by the name of Asa. We'll get to that in just a moment. But notice with me again, it says, in everything that Jehoshaphat followed the ways of his father Asa, he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Now, we're told in another place in 2 Chronicles chapter 17, it says, we won't turn there to read it, but it says that Asa not only followed the ways of, Jehoshaphat followed not only the ways of his father Asa, but he said he also followed the example of his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather David. And that Jehoshaphat was as faithful to God as David was faithful to God. That he followed the ways of his father Asa, his immediate father, and his great-grandfather David. That he was known for that. Well, what were the ways of David, and how did they work for the people of Israel? Somebody tell me. Was David a pretty good guy? What happened to Israel when David was king? They prospered. They prospered big time. I was just reading this week how that under David's son, who continued the way David was leading, that silver became as common as stones. They didn't even bother to count how much silver they had, because it was just ordinary. It was like you and I going out and finding a stone on the side of the road. It was gravel. So the only thing they counted was their gold, because they had so much, because they were such a prosperous nation. And David's prosperity was a direct result of his faithfulness to God. God said so, because David had been faithful to live and to serve God, and God blessed him as a result of that. God gave David victory over all of the kings that lived around him, the ones that kept trying to intrude on their land and trying to take away from them cities that were part of the nation of Israel. David was given victory over those kings, and so David became a very influential and a very wealthy man. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to associate this morning wealth and prosperity with righteousness. They don't necessarily go together. But they aren't necessarily excluded by one another either. And in this particular case, because of David's faithfulness, God blessed him. Both Asa and David are described, these two men that were influential in Jehoshaphat's life, both of them are described as fully committed in their hearts to follow God. We know a lot about David, but we know a little bit less about Asa. Let me tell you a little bit about Asa. You can read about Asa in 2 Chronicles 14 through 16. Asa became king over the nation of Judah and became a reformer. Asa became king at a time when Judah had not been following God. And so Asa came in, and Asa began to lead the people of Judah back into a relationship with God. He began to remind them of how God had called them to be his very people. And so Asa began to lead the people of Judah back into a relationship with God. In the same way that Asa's heart was fully committed to following God, Asa was trying to lead the people of Judah back to that kind of spiritual life that Asa had experienced with God. A decision made at the end of his life, again, poor choice, and it had a negative effect on him. But even with that decision and its impact on his life, he set a powerful example for his son, and he was still recognized as a man who was completely devoted to God. He loved God with all of his heart. Matter of fact, Asa led such effective reforms in the land of Judah that some of the other tribes of Israel that had gone away from God and had moved to the northern kingdom above came back to Judah and lived with them because it was a place of spiritual life. And in the area where Asa provided rulership, God was working some pretty incredible things in their lives and blessing them. And these folks said, you know what, it's pretty obvious to us who the right God is to serve. And so we're going to go back to Jerusalem, and we're going to live there. We're going to pull up stakes and move our whole families back to where we can be with where God's blessing is coming. Now this really gets to it. Asa had an ungodly grandmother. How ungodly was it? Anybody ever heard of King Ahab? I don't mean Ahab the Arab. King Ahab. King Ahab was probably the worst king that Israel ever had. King Ahab was the kind of guy who would sacrifice his own children as a burnt offering to the gods that he worshiped. That's the kind of guy that King Ahab was. There wasn't just about anything that King Ahab wouldn't do. You ever heard of Jezebel? That was Ahab's wife. She was worse than him. Well, Asa's grandmother was Ahab's relative. And she tried to bring this ungodly worship into Judah when Asa was king. All of us have grandmothers, right? Okay. And you all know we treat grandma really well, right? Okay. My wife told me a joke yesterday. She said, you know, how did it go, Sherry?
Grandkids misbehave because they want to spank grandma.
Yeah. Did you hear that? The grandkids misbehave because no one will spank grandma. Okay? Grandma kind of rules the roost. Okay? Asa removed his grandmother as queen mother of Israel because she was so ungodly. He said, it will not happen. We are going to follow God. We are going to honor God. Okay? That's the kind of example that Jehoshaphat followed. And so when we talk about Jehoshaphat walking in the ways of his of his father and of his grandfather. We are talking about a man who was following the example of some pretty powerful people in his life. I've got some other notes here, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward to talk about the principle of influence, because that's really what we're talking about here. Why is it that Jehoshaphat followed Asa, and why did he follow David? Because they had influence in his life. They impacted his life. And he said to himself, I want to be like my dad. Have you ever said that? Have you ever said, I want to be like so-and-so? Nike made a living on it about 20 years ago. Anybody ever heard the commercial, I want to be like Mike? Remember that? Pretty influential stuff. And we're just talking tennis shoes. We all look at people and we see something in someone and we say, I like that. I want to be like that. I want my life to have that kind of quality and character to it. I want to become a person of that kind of substance. We all do. Your life and my life, as hard as it may be for you to believe, your life and my life has influence. You have influence because people watch other people. People watch. Anybody here besides me like people watching? I don't mean weirdness, okay? I don't mean stalking, okay? But just, I love going to places like Disneyland or the ballpark and just sitting and watching. That's better entertainment than anything on TV. Because people really do some funny stuff. They really do. And it's fun to just watch and see how people react and how they do what they do, how they live life as they choose to do it. It really is fun. The principle of influence underscores this fact to us, folks. The principle of influence underscores this fact to us. Our actions matter. Can I say that to you again? Our actions matter. Because people watch and people pay attention. And people look at what you and I do, and you know what they do? They say, oh, well, if they can do it, I can. Let me ask you a question. Can we prove that statement for a second? How many of you have done that same thing? Because I saw somebody else do it, it's okay for me to do it. It's something that I can allow to be a part of my life. And the people who watch and justify are most often your family members, especially children. Chad was a little guy, and Sherry and I were having coffee. I'm sorry, it's Father's Day. Okay, it's my prerogative to tell family stories. One day we were having coffee. It was a Saturday morning. We were having coffee together. Sherry and I were. Chad was maybe 3. And I was, just like, I don't know if there's a place for me to do this here. I was just leaning up against the counter with my legs crossed like this. Just talking to Sherry, just chit-chatting. The next thing I know, I look down at Chad, and he's leaning up against the counter with his leg crossed, and just hanging out with Dad. He's 3 years old, for Pete's sake. 3-year-olds don't stand like that. Unless Dad's exerting some influence. Unless he's wanting to be like Dad. So you have people that are doing that in your life all the time. See, Jehoshaphat saw something in Asa. He didn't even get to see it in David because David was already dead, but he heard about it. Because Asa did the same thing. Asa followed in the ways of David. And they began to emulate those ways. Here's the incredible thing, folks. It reset the course of a nation. Asa started it with his reforms. Jehoshaphat took it to another level with his influence. And it reset the course of a nation. Who's seated among us this morning might reset the course of a family? Who among us this morning might reset the course of the climate in your office because you choose to be a person of influence? And to let that influence have a positive impact. You don't have to be heavy-handed with it. You just choose to live as a person whose life reflects the kind of character that pleases God. It's interesting when we talk about emulating the behavior of someone else, because God tells us to do that. In the scripture, he says, be holy. Somebody finish it. For I am holy. Be holy, for I am holy. Be like me. Jesus said to his disciples, come follow me. That wasn't just about direction. That was about becoming like him. Come follow me, and I will make you to be fishers of men. The call to us is for that very thing. And the very issue of discipleship. How many of you consider yourself a disciple of Jesus? The very issue of discipleship is that we become like the one who is our discipler. That we become like him. And that his influence is exerted on our lives. So that when people walk down the street and they see us respond to circumstances and just living out our lives, it's as if Jesus were right there. It is that kind of quality and characteristic. The question for us to answer is this, because the phrase that we're spinning off of this morning, and he followed the ways of his fathers. The question is, what are the ways that you and I lead? What are the things that people are seeing in us that they follow? What would they identify as the characteristics of our lives? There's a famous epitaph that reads this way: as you are now, so I once was. As I am now, so soon you will be. Prepare for death and follow me. And someone pinned a little superscription to that, and it said, and it went this way: to follow you, I am not content until I know which way you went. People are looking for the way we're going. And you and I are people of influence. The power of your influence is major in either direction of life, to follow God or not. Let's be sure we're leading in godly ways. I have one more point to share with you, and it has to do with Jehoshaphat's son. Because, as we've already talked about this morning, Asa was a reformer. And Asa influenced the nation of Israel. Asa touched the lives of the people of Judah. Jehoshaphat came along behind him and took the reforms to an even higher level. And then, of course, as kings do, Jehoshaphat died. And Jehoshaphat had a son that followed him, and his name was Jehoram. What do you think Jehoram was like? What would you think Jehoram was like?
Like his father.
Yeah, you'd think so, huh? You would think that Jehoram just kept taking things to higher and higher levels. The sad story is, when Jehoram became king, he killed all of his brothers. First move, he killed all his brothers. The second move was to become just like King Ahab. Remember me talking about him? And one thing led to another and to another. Here's the thing I want you to see with me. Influence works both ways. There are other people who are influencing the people around you. Ahab was an influencer too. Jehoram chose to follow Ahab. What we want to do is we want to be the ones that influence the lives of folks. When Jehoram died, I think I told you this earlier in the service. When Jehoram died, it is said about him, and he died to the sorrow of no one. Because he was such a corrupt, ungodly, vicious king. Okay? Some of you as parents have lived a godly life before your kids, and some of your kids have decided not to follow Jesus.
Right.
And one of the things that can be a bitter pill for you to swallow is the sense of responsibility that you have for what your kids have done in choosing not to follow Jesus. Let me tell you something. God's first kids didn't follow him either. They chose a different path. And we raise our kids and they come to us to a point of adulthood, they will make their own decisions. And you are not accountable for that decision when you have lived a life of influence before your kids. Because free will is a wonderful thing. God gave us an incredible gift when he gave us free will. But you know what, folks? It's also a choice that you and I can make to do things contrary to what God would have us do. And our kids can make those same decisions. Jehoshaphat followed in the ways of his father because he chose to listen and look at the influence of his father and let that become the course that directed his life. He could have chosen otherwise, but he didn't. And if for some reason your kids choose otherwise, then it's time for us to pray. And it's time for us to continue to learn. And it's time for us to continue to live the life of influence before them in the belief that God will touch their lives as well. I want to close this morning by doing two things. Number one, I'd like to close by praying with you about being people who leave a godly example. People who accept the role of being the influencers. Because mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, aunts and uncles, you have an opportunity to be an influencer in your family and an ongoing opportunity. And I want to pray with you to that end. But then I also want to pray with you if you're here this morning and you have children that you have lived the example before, but they've chosen not to follow. They've chosen an alternative path in their lives. I want to pray with you. I want to pray for strength for you, and we want to pray for your kids. So let's bow our heads. Would you do that?